My name is Isabella Cole. I am 28 years old, and if you look at me today, you might think I have always been strong. But the truth is, my life began in silence inside a house where my presence was barely acknowledged. My brother Ethan was the golden boy, my stepfather Richard's pride, while I was treated as an inconvenience. They believed I would never rise beyond the shadows, never be more than the maid they once mocked me to be. I still remember the sting of their laughter, and I still remember the night Ethan stood at his wedding and made the entire room laugh at my expense. They thought I would bow my head as always. But they were wrong. That night I spoke, and the truth I revealed shattered everything they had built. Boston was the city where my childhood unfolded, though not with the warmth or tenderness most children are given. I was 6 years old when my mother Margaret married Richard Cole, the powerful owner of Falcon Partners Financial Group. From the moment he entered our lives, the soft watercolor of my world hardened into something cold and rigid, like frost overtaking spring blossoms. Richard never once looked at me as a daughter. To him, I was little more than the unwanted reminder of my mother's past, a mistake that did not fit into his carefully curated future. Ethan became the centerpiece of that future. He was the chosen heir, the golden boy, whose every minor accomplishment was magnified into proof of greatness. The way Richard's eyes lit up when Ethan entered a room was the same way they dimmed when they landed on me. My mother tried in her quiet way to bridge the distance. Sometimes under the long dining table, her hand would squeeze mine, a silent apology for not being able to speak louder. Dinner in our house was always a performance. The crystal glasses sparkled under chandeliers, silverware glinted as though wealth itself had a voice. Richard would recount his million-dollar deals as if narrating epic victories, while Ethan, barely 10 at the time, was praised for something as small as bringing home a decent grade in arithmetic. My own achievements, like winning statewide literary competitions, were brushed aside with polite nods, acknowledgments that carried the weight of dismissal. I learned early that silence was safer than seeking recognition. The moment that sealed my place in that household came one Christmas when I was 10. The house was rich with the scent of pine and polished wood, the tree glittering with ornaments like a constellation brought indoors. Ethan was handed a shining custom-made bicycle, the kind that gleamed like a crown on wheels. The room erupted in cheers, applause bouncing off the walls as if he had conquered the world. When my turn came, a small box was passed to me. I unwrapped it slowly, only to find a pair of socks already worn thin at the edges. Richard's voice was flat, his tone clipped like the end of a business deal. "You should be grateful you even have a roof over your head." The words struck colder than the snow outside. Ethan paraded his bicycle in front of the guests, his laughter echoing like victory bells, while I sat frozen with the socks in my lap. The guests, a sea of faces cloaked in wealth and privilege, turned to me with expressions that blended pity and disdain. In that moment, I felt like an intruder in my own home, invisible yet humiliated all at once. That night, while the music and laughter floated up through the floors, muffled but constant, I sat alone in my small room. The walls were bare. The thin blanket on my bed, barely holding back the winter chill that pressed against the glass. The Christmas lights outside blinked mockingly their cheer, a cruel contrast to the ache inside my chest. My heart pounded with a hurt too large for a child to bear. I pulled close an old notebook my mother had once owned, its yellowed pages fragile but waiting. For the first time, I wrote for myself. The pencil scratched softly, but to me it sounded like defiance, a small rebellion against the silence that had defined me. My words were shaky, uneven, but fierce in their own way. One day, I wrote, "I will leave this place. I will make them remember my name." When I finally turned off the lamp, pulling the rough blanket over my shoulders, the vow I had written lingered like a flame in the darkness. I was only a child, but already I carried a wound too deep to be seen, a scar that bled silently inside me. That scar became my burden, but also my companion. It whispered to me as I drifted to sleep, reminding me that my story had already begun, shaped in the shadows of a forgotten childhood. By the time I reached my teens, the shape of my life in the Cole house needed no explanation. Ethan was always the one they polished and displayed, the son who embodied every expectation, while I moved through the rooms like a piece of furniture seen but never regarded. We slept under the same roof and shared the same meals, but belonging was a language I never learned there. So I turned to another language instead, one made of books, late nights, and ink-stained fingers. If they would not name my worth, I would try to carve it out myself. I remember the day I won a full scholarship to Northwood High with a clarity that still stings. The auditorium smelled of waxed floors and lemon polish. My teachers clapped as I stepped down from the stage, classmates hugging me like the world had grown wider, kinder. For a brief heartbeat, I let myself imagine that when I returned home, even Richard and Ethan might look at me differently. That fragile hope lasted until Ethan came home with his new varsity jacket, and Richard decided to throw a dinner in his honor. The dining room gleamed like a stage chandeliers, blazing overhead, crystal chiming as glasses met. Men laughed over deals and patted Richard's back, their approval his favorite currency. I stood at the edge, clutching a paper plate cake cooling untouched in my hand, trying not to let disappointment show. Ethan caught my eye, raised his glass, and with deliberate loudness said, "She's smart. Sure, but what else can she do besides scrub floors and wash dishes?" Laughter followed like a blade. Some indulgent, some cutting, but all of it landed the same way inside me. Richard's approving nod was worse than the laughter. It was a verdict. I kept my face still, but shame soaked me like wet cloth. In that moment, something hardened inside, a quiet coal of determination hidden even from myself. If humiliation could be turned against me, then I would learn to turn resolve into armor. At 18, bills spoke louder than hope. College required money, and I had no choice but to listen. I took a maid's job at a modest Boston hotel. The uniform was a stiff blue dress, scratchy on my skin, and the smell of bleach clung to me long after each shift. My days became a rhythm of rattling carts, vacuum hisses, and polished mirrors, reflecting a tired girl who barely recognized herself. I learned to fold sheets with sharp corners to make strangers' rooms look like havens I myself did not have. To me, it was honest work. To them, it was humiliation dressed as destiny. One afternoon, turning in a corridor, I almost collided with Ethan. His face lit with cruel delight. He didn't look away. He pulled out his phone, dialed his friends, and laughed loud enough to make the hallway ring. "You should see this," he said. "My sister was born to be a maid." The words cut deeper than any chemical sting. My hands clenched on the cart handle until my knuckles went white. I kept pushing each wheel's clack of a drumbeat for a small private anger. I told myself out loud that dignity was not defined by the uniform I wore. When Margaret found out, she pressed an envelope into my palm, her voice breaking. "Take it, Bella. You shouldn't have to suffer like this." Her tears were warm against my hair when I leaned into her embrace, but I shook my head. "I want to do this on my own," I whispered. I refused the charity, even as I accepted her arms around me. Her love was a harbor real but fragile, never strong enough to shield me from Richard's shadow. Months later, during one of Richard's glittering gatherings, Ethan staged his cruelest performance yet. He raised his glass and announced to the entire room, "Do you know what my sister does now? She's a maid. A real talent for polishing floors." Laughter rippled sharp and mocking. Richard tapped his fork against a glass and added with a smirk, "Let's toast to her success." The sound of crystal chiming was like knives striking bone. They thought it was amusing. They thought it was final. My face burned, my throat tightened, but I refused to let them see me break. I stood silent, palms pressed hard against my sides, until the tremor passed. Later, in the quiet of my room, I opened my old journal, the one I had carried since childhood. The streetlight outside threw a pale stripe across the page. My hand trembled, but the words came steady. "The more they mock me, the stronger I will rise. My life will not end in their laughter." The ink smudged under my damp fingers, but the vow remained clear. Their cruelty had carved deep wounds, but those wounds had become fuel. Pain sharpened me. Resolve hardened me. I closed the journal, pressed my palm over its cover, and whispered into the dark, "One day they will bow their heads." Not in pity, in respect. The morning I left Boston for New York, I carried nothing more than a battered suitcase and the same journal I had been writing in since childhood. They were not just belongings, they were vows. Every page whispered the same promise: I will prove them wrong. With a full scholarship in finance, I stepped into the university's halls with wide eyes and a heart clenched around fierce hope. New York pulsed with noise. The blare of horns, the rush of footsteps, the restless hum of ambition, but to me it was not chaos. It was a possibility. It was the doorway to the life I was determined to claim. My student years were not gentle. By day I drowned myself in textbooks and market reports, tracing the logic of balance sheets and futures contracts, until the numbers followed me into my dreams. By night I wore a maid's uniform in a small midtown hotel, pushing carts that squeaked along carpeted hallways, stripping beds, scrubbing bathrooms, until bleach burned my nose. There were nights I fell asleep with a pen still in my hand, waking hours later with ink stains across my fingers. Yet every dawn I rose again. Fatigue could not stop me. Mockery could not stop me. Even doubt could not stop me. One afternoon after class, Professor Evelyn Reed called me aside. Her sharp eyes softened her smile, unexpected but steady. "Bella," she said, "if you keep this pace, you have the mind to become one of the strongest financial analysts of your generation." Her words sank into me like water into parched earth. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe it might be true. When graduation came, so did an offer from a mid-sized Manhattan investment firm. I still remember the first morning I buttoned up a tailored suit, the fabric stiff with newness. I stood taller in it, almost childlike in my pride. The lobby's marble floors gleamed as if they were waiting for me to prove I belonged. I worked as if carrying two lives on my shoulders, the girl they once mocked for scrubbing floors, and the woman determined to dissect markets with precision. Days blurred into nights of study. Colleagues began to joke that I never guessed wrong when predicting the market. Each comment was fragile proof that I was climbing. I held them close, though I rarely showed gratitude aloud. But stability shattered sooner than I imagined. A little over a year into the job, the firm announced sweeping layoffs. My name was on the list. At first I told myself it was just the economy, a cruel twist of chance. I packed my desk into a cardboard box, my fingers lingering on the edge of my employee badge before dropping it inside. Then it happened again, and again. 3 firms, 3 dismissals, 3 letters dressed in polite language but ending the same way. Each time I folded the paper, my chest tightened, as if the walls of New York were pressing me out. And then the question came, the question that refused to leave me alone. Was someone working against me? Or was my brother right all along when he sneered that I was only fit to serve? On one of the rare nights I returned to Boston, I found myself once more at Richard's glittering dining table. Silver gleamed, the scent of roasted meat filled the air, but the old tension still hummed. Ethan leaned back, smirking, curling like smoke. 3 firms, 3 dismissals, he said slowly, savoring the words. Maybe that maid's uniform really is your calling. Richard lifted his glass, his tone smooth as he added, "At least as a maid no one can fire you." Laughter scattered around the table, some genuine, some forced, but every note landed like nails. I bit my lip until I tasted bitterness, forcing myself not to tremble. Their voices followed me long after the plates were cleared, shadows that clung to my silence. With my savings gone and New York rent impossible, I left. Chicago offered a tiny apartment, paint-peeling walls, cracked like veins. No matter how much I scrubbed, the air carried a faint smell of mildew. Each night I collapsed into the sagging mattress with hands rough from another temporary job. One evening I sat by the narrow window, staring at my palms, red calloused, aching. I tried so hard I whispered into the empty room. I really did. So why do doors keep slamming in my face? The silence answered, heavy and merciless. But in that silence, a faint ember refused to die. I leaned against the cold glass. Outside, Chicago's neon lights, flickered colors bleeding into each other, weary but unyielding. My reflection stared back tired eyes, shadows deep beneath them, but in their depths burned a small spark. If they think I am going to break, I thought they are wrong. I would rather start again from nothing than surrender to their judgment. The draft seeped through the thin window pane, brushing against my skin like a reminder of how alone I was. And yet, as I watched the distant lights burn steady against the night, I felt something stir inside me. Perhaps the very resilience they mocked was the strength I had been building all along. The first months in Chicago felt like walking through a haze of gray skies and rain-slick sidewalks, each day mirroring the heaviness inside me. I took whatever jobs I could find. Morning shifts, waiting tables in diners that smelled of burnt coffee and fried onions. Afternoons, scrubbing hotel rooms where the air carried traces of the guests who had come and gone, and late-night janitorial work in sterile office buildings that hummed with fluorescent lights. Every dollar I earned went to rent and food that never quite filled me. At night I lay in my cramped room, wind sighing against the old glass panes, and asked myself the same question over and over. Was this it? Was I destined to live as a shadow trampled under the weight of others' contempt? No matter how I tried to silence them, the voices of my family returned in the dark. Ethan's laughter, sharp as glass, always came first. "Being a maid is the best job for you," he had said, his words clattering in my head like silverware dropped onto china. Then Richard's smooth, dismissive voice followed, cutting deeper than I cared to admit. "At least no one can fire you if you are cleaning floors." Those words chased me awake in the middle of the night, my body slick with sweat, my chest tight with humiliation. I felt like a prisoner locked in a box built out of their judgment, suffocating beneath its walls. My mother Margaret called me often. Her voice trembled thin as thread, always beginning with worry and ending with a plea. "Bella, come back," she would say softly. "Richard can find a place for you at his firm. It would be easier." Each time my reply was steady, though my hands shook as I held the phone. "Mom, I cannot live off their pity." The silence that followed was worse than the words. Then came the sound of her crying, muffled and aching. I knew she loved me, but her love was fragile against the power Richard held over her. That frailty cut deeper than any insult, because it reminded me of how little protection I truly had. One winter evening, the city felt colder than usual. I stumbled home after an extra shift, every step dragging. My arms ached, my back burned, and the moment I dropped my worn canvas bag by the door, the dam inside me broke. I crumpled onto the floor, sobs tearing out of me, my shoulders shaking uncontrollably. The sound filled the tiny room, raw and unrestrained, like a cry no one would ever hear. Why must I fight so hard? I thought, against everyone, against everything. Would I ever be free of the suffocating shadow the Cole family cast over me? Later that night, I opened my old journal, its pages frayed at the edges. My hand trembled as I wrote. "I hate this weakness in myself, but I will not let them see me cry." The words bled into the paper, shaky but defiant. Even in my despair, there was a flicker of resistance, a stubborn refusal to let their contempt define me. I clung to that flicker. I kept reading financial reports, scanning articles online, haunting international forums where people debated markets and strategies. It was my way of reminding myself that I was not just a maid, not just the sum of their cruel words. Then one night, while posting a detailed analysis of a European market trend, a private message appeared on my screen. "Have you ever considered working on a global scale?" The question froze me. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. Finally, I typed back with a bitter smile tugging at my lips. Who would want someone who has been fired from 3 firms, yet even as I hit send, a tiny spark ignited inside me. The idea, impossible as it seemed, settled into my chest with quiet persistence. That night I closed my journal and looked out the window at the city lights. Chicago glittered in the distance, indifferent but alive. My reflections stared back at me, weary but unbroken. If I ever get a chance, I whisper into the stillness, just one chance, I will seize it, and this time no one will take it from me. The morning in Chicago was so bitterly cold that my breath fogged the air as I walked back from an overnight cleaning shift. My body ached with fatigue, the sting of disinfectant still clinging to my hands. I dropped into the worn chair by the window of my small room and opened my laptop more out of habit than hope. My inbox was cluttered with overdue bills, discount ads, and reminders I did not want to face. Then one subject line stopped me in my tracks. London Global Fund. Remote financial consultant opportunity. At first I scoffed, convinced it was another cruel scam meant to bait desperate people like me. But as I clicked through, the wording struck a different chord. Professional, measured, and clear. The email bore the seal of a company I had only read about in financial journals. For a long moment, I just stared, frozen. Then, unbidden, I heard Ethan's voice echo inside my head, that sneering tone he always carried. "Some people are only good for scrubbing floors, Bella." The words reverberated like footsteps in an empty hallway, and I clenched my fist until the coarse fabric of my work pants bit into my palm. My chest rose and fell with a shaky breath. "Fine, Ethan," I thought. "You want to see what I can do? Watch me." I typed my response before I could second-guess myself agreeing to an online interview that same evening. When the call began, I was seated in my shabby apartment with peeling wallpaper behind me and the faint hum of the radiator filling the silence. Yet as soon as the camera light blinked on something inside me shifted. I straightened, I spoke with precision, my voice steady, even though exhaustion tugged at my eyes. They asked about European market trends, about risk management strategies, about the volatility of energy investments. I answered as though I were sitting in a Manhattan office tower, rather than a crumbling studio on the South Side. The words flowed, not forced, drawn from years of study and nights spent over textbooks I could barely afford. Days later, the confirmation arrived. "Bella, we are pleased to welcome you to the team." My hands trembled as I read the line over and over, hardly able to believe it. I whispered aloud, as though saying it might make it real. "They want me." The first assignment came quickly, heavier than I expected. The fund was considering a massive investment in a European energy project, one that promised returns but carried unsettling risks. My task was to analyze every shred of available data and present a recommendation. Failure could mean millions lost. I buried myself in reports. Pages of numbers blurred together under the dim light of my desk lamp. I cross-checked graphs, compared historical models, and reread obscure articles until my vision swam. The nights stretched into mornings, my eyes burning, my shoulders tight. Sometimes I thought I could still hear Ethan's laugh weaving through the silence, mocking me for daring to believe I could belong here. But instead of breaking me, it kept me awake. Each echo fueled me to push harder. When the day of the video meeting came, I looked directly into the screen and delivered my conclusion. "This project is a trap," I said, my voice unwavering. "The contracts are structured to siphon capital. Entering would be catastrophic." For a second, silence pressed down like a weight. Then the head of strategy nodded slowly. My analysis was accepted, recorded, and forwarded to the board. A week later, headlines spread across financial outlets. The energy project collapsed amid scandal, wiping out those who had invested. But not London Global Fund. Not us. My phone buzzed with a direct message from the CEO himself. "Bella, you just saved us a fortune. We need people like you." I sat there, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For the first time in my life, recognition was not a hollow gesture or a backhanded insult. It was real. It was earned. I glanced across my small apartment at the maid's uniform still hanging by the door. It no longer mocked me. It no longer defined me. It was a relic of a past I had survived. From that moment, new assignments arrived one after another. I joined calls with analysts in London, debated market strategies, and defended my views with the confidence I once thought I had lost forever. I was still in the same cramped apartment, still walking past the same worn uniform, but the air around me felt lighter. The girl who once cried into her pillow, convinced she was worthless, was gone. That night I opened my journal, the one that had carried my pain for so many years. My hand was steady as I wrote. They believed I was meant for nothing but a broom and a mop. But from London, I have proven that my worth is undeniable. I set the pen down and let the words sink in. For the first time in a long while, I felt as if the light outside my window belonged to me. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was bent over spreadsheets in my cramped Chicago apartment. The laptop screen, normally a familiar battlefield of market forecasts and endless data, blurred when the caller ID flashed. I froze. CNN Business Special. My heart kicked against my ribs. At first I thought it must be a mistake, maybe even a cruel prank. But then I checked the official email that followed the red CNN logo, crisp and undeniable against the backdrop of my peeling walls. They wanted me. Me, Bella Cole, the girl everyone once dismissed as better suited for scrubbing floors. The producer's voice on the line was professional, but warm. "We have heard of your work with London Global Fund," they said. "We would be honored if you joined us as a guest on our national broadcast." My mouth went dry. For a second, I could hear Ethan's old sneer circling in my head, but it only made my resolve firmer. With trembling hands, I said yes. Flying to New York felt like stepping into someone else's dream. The plane rattled against the clouds while I sat gripping a borrowed leather briefcase on my lap. In the mirror of the modest hotel room, I practiced answers until my voice cracked. My suit was simple navy blue, already worn at the seams, but I smoothed it down as though it were silk. I whispered to my reflection. They once told me I was fit only for dust and brooms. Tomorrow the country will see me for who I really am. Walking into the CNN studio was like walking into a storm. The lights were blinding, the buzz of cameras filled the air, and staff moved quickly with headsets pressed to their ears. For a moment my knees felt weak, but then the host's voice rose above the noise. Warm, inviting, steady. Today we are joined by Isabella Cole, one of the rising analysts whose accurate predictions have caught the attention of the market. Hearing my name framed like that nearly unraveled me, but I held my breath and steadied my voice. When the microphones went live, I spoke with clarity I didn't know I had. I dissected market shifts, explained energy futures, and laid out risk strategies as though I had been born beneath those studio lights. My voice carried across the airwaves, confident and measured. I could almost see the girl I used to be sitting silent at family dinners, invisible behind Ethan's shadow. Now I was the one being heard. The segment ended and applause filled the room from the crew. The host shook my hand firmly, looked me in the eye, and said, "You've made quite an impression. We'll have you back." For the first time, the weight I had carried for years felt lighter. On the flight back to Chicago, my phone buzzed nonstop. Former classmates I hadn't spoken to in years sent congratulatory messages. Professors who once doubted me wrote lines of pride. Even a colleague who used to smirk at my struggles texted simply, "I saw you on CNN. You really did it." My throat tightened, and tears blurred the glowing city lights beneath the plane. Back in Boston, far from me, my brother Ethan and his friend Richard happened to catch the segment replay in the corner of a cafe. Ethan smirked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Just luck." Richard lifted his cup, pretending to agree, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. That seed of envy planted in silence began to grow in the cracks of their ambition. The apartment in Chicago hummed with the familiar silence of old pipes and the faint whir of my laptop. I had just closed the file for the London Global Fund, another report carefully built line by line, when the shrill ring of my phone cut through the quiet. The name on the screen made my chest tighten. Margaret. My mother? I sat staring at the glow for a moment, drawing in a long, reluctant breath before swiping to answer. Her voice came thin, trembling like a fragile thread stretched too far. "Bella, sweetheart, Ethan is getting married. To Sophie. The wedding will be in New York. You know how grand it will be. All of Richard's partners, everyone important, they will all be there." My throat closed up. The thought of walking back into that gilded cage, of standing again in the shadows of people who had always treated me as less than human, filled me with dread. I whispered almost to myself, I don't think I can." She did not argue with logic or promises, only with the breaking sound of her heart. I know you don't want to, darling, but if you are not there, they will laugh at me. Please, Bella, just this once. Her words pulled me back through years of memory. The helpless way she would look at me across Richard's long dining table, unable to defend me from their barbs, her eyes filled with apologies she could never speak. I had sworn never to return to that place. Yet the desperation in her plea pressed against me harder than the bitterness I carried. I closed my eyes, hearing again the laughter in my ears, Richard's smirk, Ethan's voice mocking me even as I stood proud at CNN. They had never called me family, never treated me as anything more than an inconvenience. But then came the sound of my mother's soft sob, a muffled cry down the line that cracked my resolve. Slowly, with a steel that surprised even me, I answered, "Yes, Mom, I'll go. But I will not let them belittle me again." Her relief was audible, a sharp intake of breath before it broke into tears. "Thank you, Bella. Thank you. Just knowing you will be there eases my heart." I sat still with the phone pressed to my ear, the sound of her crying both painful and tender like rain on fragile glass. After we hung up, I walked to the wardrobe in the corner of the room. The doors creaked as I opened them to reveal my limited choices, a row of simple shirts and trousers. My hand settled on a navy dress, plain, but fitted the kind of clothing that spoke of quiet dignity rather than opulence. I laid it across the bed and reached for the old pair of heels tucked beneath. The leather was worn, but they had carried me through interviews and sleepless nights of ambition. They would carry me again. On the desk sat my laptop, still open, its glow faint against the dim apartment. A small USB drive rested beside it, innocuous in size, but heavy with what it contained. Documents I had copied late at night, trails of numbers and names that whispered truths my family had buried. I slipped it into the side pocket of my clutch, my hand lingering on it for a moment. I told myself I was only carrying it for protection, a silent shield if things turned cruel again. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Standing before the mirror, I touched the reflection of the woman staring back at me. The lines of exhaustion around my eyes, the resilience in my shoulders, the fire flickering in my gaze. The girl who once pushed a mop through hotel corridors was gone. Tomorrow they will not meet that girl. Tomorrow they will meet Isabella. Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by the rush of thoughts. What would I see in Ethan's eyes when he spotted me in the crowd? Would Richard smirk, ready with some cutting remark, or would they be unsettled by the quiet strength I now carried? The clock hands circled endlessly, but by dawn I was awake, heart pounding with something that was neither fear nor excitement, but a potent mixture of both. At the airport, I clutched my ticket, the weight of my small carry-on bag pressing into my arm. The terminal buzzed with voices and rolling suitcases, but all I could hear was the thrum inside my chest. As the plane lifted into the air, I looked out at the shrinking grid of Chicago beneath me, lights twinkling like fading stars. Each mile that carried me eastward felt like a step deeper into my past, and yet also closer to the confrontation I had been avoiding my entire life. Somewhere beneath the cloud line, New York waited, dazzling and unforgiving. The skyline would welcome me with its sharp edges and burning lights, but I would not arrive as the girl they once mocked. I would walk into that wedding carrying not only my name, but my victories, my scars, and my unshakable resolve. And this time, if they tried to strip me of my dignity, I would not come unarmed. I leaned my head against the cold window, whispering into the roar of the engines. I don't know what is waiting for me there, but this time, I am ready. The crisp Manhattan air did nothing to calm the storm churning in my stomach as I stepped out of the taxi. Before me rose a hotel so grand it seemed to scrape the sky, its entrance swallowed by a deep red carpet that rolled like a river of velvet into the glowing lobby. Towering white orchids flanked the path, their petals like pale flames guiding the procession of guests into the palace within. Everywhere I turned shimmered with opulence. Sequined gowns caught the light like shards of starlight, tuxedos hung on men with the effortless posture of entitlement, and diamonds glittered from necks and wrists as if wealth itself had taken form and walked among us. Against that sea of extravagance, I stood in my navy dress, modest and understated, a single dark note in a chorus of brilliance. My clutch felt small and plain in my hand, but I held it tightly, refusing to shrink under the cascade of sidelong glances and whispered appraisals that followed me through the doorway. What no one could see was what I carried inside it. Lipstick, a folded handkerchief, yes, but also something harder, colder. A secret pressed into the palm of my hand. My fingers brushed against the smooth edge of a USB drive hidden, but humming with consequence. I had spent nights gathering files, copying documents, making sure that if my voice was ignored, the truth would not be. It was my quiet weapon, a blade no one else knew I carried. Inside the ballroom was nothing short of breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers dripped gold onto white-clothed tables where champagne flutes gleamed and silver cutlery shone like polished mirrors. Waiters in white gloves glided silently, pouring vintage wine into glasses that never seemed to empty. Laughter rose and fell like waves, punctuated by the delicate chime of crystal against crystal. Somewhere in the background, a string quartet played music so elegant it felt like the very walls were humming. I lingered near the edge of the crowd, my back straight, my chin held higher than my heart wanted to allow. My solitude felt heavy, a small island in this ocean of celebration. Still, I would not let myself waver. This was Ethan's world now, and Richard's domain, but I would not dissolve into invisibility. Then Sophie appeared and the room shifted. She was the kind of bride magazines were built to worship. Her gown, haute couture, and impossibly delicate, shimmered like liquid light as she moved. Gasps and admiration followed her like a tide. I studied her closely, and the thought struck me like a whisper from my own soul. She wasn't just marrying Ethan. She was marrying into Richard's empire, into the power and prestige that had always defined him. Richard took her arm with a flourish, his voice booming as he addressed the crowd. "My new daughter-in-law, the jewel of the Cole family." The applause that followed filled every corner of the ballroom, a roar of approval that left me standing in silence. His gaze swept across the crowd, careful and proud. But when it reached me, it passed over, as though I were made of smoke. In that moment, I was once again reminded that to Richard, I was nothing but a shadow. I scanned the room and found my mother. Margaret sat near the end of a long table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She smiled when others looked her way, but I knew that smile. It was fragile, a porcelain mask stretched over the anxiety quivering underneath. I could see it in the way her shoulders drew inward, in the faint tremor at the corner of her lips. Her joy was a performance, just like mine was a shield. The evening swelled toward its peak. Toasts rang out, voices overlapping in a tapestry of congratulations. Glasses lifted, music swelled, and yet a cold current moved beneath the glamour. My eyes followed Ethan as he stepped onto the stage, tuxedo gleaming black against the light, his posture radiating the arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything. The crowd quieted, their faces lifted in expectation. His voice carried easily, smooth and confident. "Thank you all for joining me and Sophie on the happiest day of our lives." The words seemed harmless enough, but then his gaze found me. It locked on, sharp and deliberate, like a predator singling out its prey. A faint smile touched his lips, not the smile of joy, but of calculation, of something cruel. I felt the shiver trace my spine before I could stop it. My body knew what my mind was only beginning to accept. This was no simple toast. This was a stage he had built not just to celebrate his union, but to craft my humiliation. I saw it in the flicker of his eyes, the smirk that seemed to know secrets no one else in the room shared. Around me, guests leaned forward, eager to drink in his words, unaware that I was already bracing for impact. My breath caught, my heartbeat quickened, and the noise of the room dimmed until all I could hear was the pounding in my chest. Somewhere deep inside, a voice rose steady and unyielding. "They think this is their night. They think I will stand silent in their shadow again. But not this time." I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and prepared myself. Whatever Ethan was about to unleash, I would not meet it as the girl they once mocked. I would meet it as the woman who had clawed her way out of every dismissal, every insult, every locked door. And as the room erupted once more in laughter and clinking glasses, I knew with absolute certainty that the real celebration was yet to come. Ethan stood tall on the stage, a glass of champagne raised high, his smile polished to perfection. The crowd hushed their anticipation, wrapping around him like a cloak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and amplified, "today marks the happiest day of my life. I want to thank my father Richard, who has always been the guiding light in my journey. And of course to Sophie, the most extraordinary woman who agreed to be my wife." Applause rippled across the ballroom, champagne glasses lifted in a glittering wave. I felt my chest tighten. I had seen that smirk before, the faint curl at the corner of Ethan's lips, the one that never meant joy but cruelty. And then it came. He turned his gaze toward me, his glass still raised. "I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge my dear sister Bella." His tone dripped with mock affection. "You've tried your hand at so many things, haven't you? But somehow nothing ever really sticks." He paused, savoring the silence. Then his smile sharpened. "But I think finally you found your true calling. Being a maid is the best job for you." A ripple of whispers tore through the crowd, followed by bursts of uneasy laughter. Some laughed outright, others only shifted uncomfortably, unsure if this was humor or cruelty. Ethan pressed on, emboldened. "At least that's one career you can't be fired from, right?" Richard threw his head back and laughed heartily, clapping Ethan on the shoulder as though he had delivered a masterstroke of wit. A cluster of guests joined in their laughter, shallow and brittle. Others lowered their eyes, pity etched in their faces. At the far table, my mother Margaret lowered her head. Her fingers twisted the edge of the tablecloth so tightly I thought it might tear. She could not look at me. That was the cruelest cut of all. I sat frozen, my champagne glass trembling in my hand. The room blurred, sound melting into the roar of blood rushing in my ears. My heart slammed against my ribs as memories crashed down, the snickers in school hallways, the whispers at family gatherings, the nights I scrubbed hotel bathrooms while Ethan celebrated under chandeliers. All of it condensed into this moment, neatly wrapped in his mockery. They expected me to shrink, to bow my head in silence. They expected me to swallow humiliation as I had done so many times before. But what they had forgotten was that I was no longer that girl. I inhaled slowly, the breath steadying me. My eyes locked with Ethan's across the room. He smirked, certain he had broken me yet again. But he didn't see the fire that had already ignited in my chest. Not tonight, not ever again. I placed the glass carefully on the table, its quiet clink sharp as a vow. My legs steadied beneath me as I rose, smoothing the navy fabric of my dress. Conversations faltered. The laughter that had filled the air moments before now hung unfinished. Each step toward the stage was deliberate. My heels struck the marble with a rhythm louder than the music. Eyes followed me, murmurs sparking in their wake. What is she doing? Is she going to leave or, worse, cause a scene? I reached the podium, my hand wrapped around the microphone, the cool metal grounding me. I lifted it slightly, the adjustment slicing the silence. "I have a few words I'd like to share," I said, my voice calm, steady, carrying further than I expected. The hush was instant, the kind that presses in from every corner. Ethan's brows furrowed, confusion breaking his polished mask. This was not his script. This was not his triumph. And as I stood there under the blaze of chandeliers and the scrutiny of hundreds of eyes, I felt clarity wash over me. Their judgment no longer weighed me down, it lifted me. For the first time in years, I was not the maid, not the afterthought, not the shadow at the edge of the family portrait. I was Bella Cole, and my voice was about to be heard. The weight of silence pressed down on the ballroom, thick enough to feel on my skin. The chandeliers above glared like 1,000 watchful eyes, their brilliance no longer celebratory, but interrogating. I held the microphone steady, its cold metal biting against my palm. Every gaze in the room was fixed on me, and for the first time I felt no urge to shrink away. Ethan leaned back slightly, Arms crossed, that smug grin carved across his face. "So this is it," he called out, his voice slicing through the quiet. "Another one of your little attempts to embarrass me. You're making yourself the clown here, Bella." Sophie, standing a step behind him, clutched her bouquet tighter, her knuckles whitening. Richard, planted firmly at a nearby table, leaned toward her with a voice pitched just low enough to carry, "Let's see what stunt she's about to pull now." His chuckle dripped with condescension. I drew in a breath and let the words leave me slow, deliberate. "Ethan is right about one thing," I said, scanning the sea of faces, pausing long enough for their unease to deepen. "I did work as a maid. I scrubbed hotel bathrooms, wiped down counters, mopped floors until my back ached. I did those things to survive, but at least that was honest work. At least that was clean. Not like building a life on deceit and stealing from the very people who trust you." A low murmur rippled through the crowd, sharp as a current racing across water. I let the sound wash over me and then reached into the small clutch I carried. My fingers closed around the smooth shape of a USB drive. I held it up, its tiny form gleaming beneath the lights like a blade. "This," I said, my voice hardening, "is not just about me anymore. I want to introduce you all to the real Ethan Cole, the one you don't see in tuxedos and wedding photos." At my nod, the technician in the corner tapped a key and the massive LED screen behind me flickered to life. Rows of emails, bank transfers, and corporate filings filled the screen. Words and numbers crawled across in damning clarity. The names of shell companies, amounts siphoned from Falcon Partners, and transactions traced directly into Ethan's accounts. My voice carried over the rising buzz of the crowd. "Here is proof that Ethan created shell companies, funneled millions from Falcon Partners into his own pockets, and even transferred funds into a trust under Richard Cole's name." The ballroom erupted. Gasps surged like a wave, followed by shouts, the scrape of chairs, and the frantic buzz of phones being pulled out. Flashes of cameras lit the edges of the room as guests rushed to capture the evidence. Richard's face flushed crimson. He shot up from his chair, fists clenched at his sides. "Enough," he thundered, his voice cracking with the force of panic. "These are fabrications. Lies designed to humiliate us." Ethan stormed forward, his face twisted with fury, reaching for the microphone in my hand. But I sidestepped him smoothly, eyes never leaving him. "If they're lies," I said evenly, "then why has this drive already been sent to the SEC, the FBI, and CNN? As we speak, reporters are outside waiting to break the story. This wedding will not be remembered for the flowers or the champagne. It will be remembered for this." The words cracked the air open. The ballroom dissolved into chaos. Guests stood, some pushing toward the exits, phones pressed to their ears, whispering urgently. Others leaned in to study the screen more closely, disbelief written across their faces. The elegant order of the event shattered, replaced by a storm of panic and speculation. Sophie's face was drained of color. Her bouquet slipped from her grasp, white roses scattering soundlessly across the polished floor. She turned toward Ethan, her lips parting, eyes wide with a horror that needed no words. The dream she thought she had married into was collapsing before her eyes. From her table, my mother Margaret sat frozen. Tears slid down her cheeks as her hands trembled against the linen tablecloth. Her expression was torn humiliation at the exposure of her family's rot, but beneath it, unmistakable pride glimmered through fierce and unyielding. She had been powerless for so long, but in that moment, through me, she could finally breathe. Ethan shouted again, but his voice was no longer sharp or commanding. It was strained cracking, swallowed by the roar of voices rising around us. "This is slander. She's jealous. That's all. Don't listen to her." He looked desperately toward Richard, whose own fury and fear betrayed him. The two of them, who had stood so invincible for years, now looked cornered, stripped of control. I lifted the microphone closer, my voice steady as I carved the final blow. "You can call me a maid. You can sneer at the work I once did to keep myself alive. But tonight this so-called maid dragged the truth into the light. And I did it on the day you thought would crown you king. The room fell into stunned silence, the kind that follows an earthquake when the ground itself feels uncertain. My words hung there, echoing, impossible to erase. I stood tall beneath the weight of their stares, the fire in my chest burning hotter than the shame they had once tried to bury me in. For the first time, I wasn't the outcast or the afterthought. I was the one with the voice. I was the one holding the truth, and they would never silence me again. The ballroom that only moments ago pulsed with champagne laughter and polished violins now cracked apart in chaos. Whispers sharpened into gasps, and gasps split into shouts. Dozens of phones were raised in trembling hands, recording live streaming, sending the Cole family's ruin into the world before their drinks could even settle back into crystal glasses. The scent of lilies from Sophie's bouquet mixed bitterly with the sharp tang of panic, as if the very air had soured. Ethan stood near the stage, his tuxedo collar damp with sweat. His hands shook as he gestured wildly, his voice breaking under the strain. "This is fake. All of it," he cried, his once commanding baritone now reduced to a brittle whine. "That USB is fabricated. Lies, all lies." The words scattered uselessly like confetti tossed into a storm. His eyes darted left and right, searching for belief, but finding none. I watched him unravel the brother who had once smirked above me, certain I would always remain in the shadows. Now his face contorted with fear, and the echo of his desperation rang hollow. Then Sophie turned to him. Her face was pale, her lipstick bleeding at the corners where she had bitten her lip too hard. Her voice quivered, but her words cut deeper than any knife. "Ethan," she whispered at first, then louder, trembling so the room could hear, "you paid for this wedding with stolen money." He froze, caught between denial and shame. Sophie's hands shook as she tugged at the diamond ring glittering on her finger. With one sharp movement, she yanked it off and let it fall. The sound of the diamond hitting the polished floor cracked like thunder. "I won't marry a fraud," she spat, her voice breaking on the last word. The crowd gasped as one, a collective intake of breath that seemed to lift the chandeliers higher. Photographers' flashes snapped like gunfire, capturing the image of Sophie's gown sweeping behind her as she stormed from the ballroom, leaving behind the wreckage of vows that had not even begun. Across the room, Richard surged to his feet, his hands slamming the table so hard the silver rattled. His face was flushed a dangerous crimson. Silence. He roared, his voice an echo of the man who once commanded boardrooms, with a flick of his hand. "I am Richard Cole. I built this empire. None of you will defy me." His words cracked in the air, but they carried no weight. The empire he clung to was already dust. Several men rose from their seats, the sharp suits of Falcon Partners' most powerful shareholders. Their faces were carved from stone, but their eyes were colder still. One of them spoke, his voice steady and cutting. "Mr. Cole, with evidence this clear, the board will convene tonight. Your leadership is no longer tenable." His words were not shouted, but the finality of them silenced even Richard's fury. The blood drained from Richard's face. His lips trembled as he tried to form words, but none came. His hands clutched the back of his chair until his knuckles turned white, as if holding to that wooden frame could keep his collapsing world intact. Then the doors at the far end of the ballroom swung wide. The sound was heavy, final, like a verdict. 2 FBI agents stepped inside, their expressions impassive, uniforms crisp beneath the ballroom's glowing chandeliers. One of them raised a paper, the voice carrying like steel through the murmurs. "Ethan Cole, Richard Cole, you are hereby summoned for questioning on charges of financial fraud and money laundering. You will come with us." The ballroom exploded again, a different kind of chaos. Now guests jostling for position, phones lifted, high voices cracking in disbelief. The orchestra, forgotten in the corner, let their instruments sag in silence. The agents moved with mechanical precision. Cold metal cuffs clicked around Ethan's wrists, his frantic struggles useless against their grip. He twisted his head toward me, his eyes bloodshot with fury. "You ruined everything," he spat, his voice raw, a child's tantrum hidden behind a man's rage. I did not flinch. My voice was calm, steady, each word sharp enough to cut through the frenzy. "No, Ethan. You ruined yourself. I only showed them the truth." Richard tried to step back, but the agents were already on either side of him. His eyes locked with mine, and for a moment I saw not the Titan of Wall Street, but a man undone, fear curdling with hatred in his gaze. He shook his head in disbelief, as if my existence in this moment was impossible. But the cuffs closed around his wrists too, and the sound of them snapped like the end of an era. The photographers surged closer, their lenses glittering, catching the sight of the Cole men led through their own celebration like criminals in a parade. Murmurs rolled across the room, a tide of disbelief, awe, and morbid satisfaction. I stood still as the storm swirled around me. The lights flashed, the whispers burned, but I remained steady. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer the girl they laughed at behind polished glasses of champagne. I was the woman who had dragged their empire into daylight and stripped it bare. As the FBI led them out, Sophie's discarded bouquet still lay on the floor, petals scattered like broken promises. My mother sat with tears streaming silently, her hand pressed to her lips. For years she had bowed beneath Richard's shadow, but now her eyes, wet with grief and relief alike, found mine. In them I saw a glimmer of strength long buried but never destroyed. When the last of the guests began to scatter their voices, tumbling out into the Manhattan night, I turned toward the doors myself. The cool air outside wrapped around me as I stepped into the street. The city lights burned steady above, uncaring, eternal. I drew in a deep breath, the first that did not carry the weight of shame in years. Justice had not come swiftly, but it had arrived. Tonight, in the most public way possible, the balance had shifted. The Cole name might remain in headlines for weeks, but it would no longer define me. As I walked down the steps, heels striking against the marble with surety, I knew the night had ended in disgrace for them. But for me it was the beginning of a freedom they could never again take away. The morning after the wedding felt strangely quiet, as though the world had paused to inhale before unleashing its roar. I woke in my small Chicago apartment, the thin curtains doing little to block out the light. My head still throbbed with echoes of the night before, Richard's furious shouts, Ethan's sputtering denial. The flashing cameras, the gasps of guests. For a moment I almost believed it had been a dream. But then my phone buzzed on the nightstand, and the screen lit up with headline after headline, each one hammering reality into place. The New York Times, financial empire shattered at lavish wedding. Los Angeles Times, Ethan and Richard Cole arrested at the altar. CNN, Isabella Cole exposes family's corruption in stunning public reveal. My hands trembled as I scrolled, the weight of it almost too much to take in. Then I set the phone down and turned to the television. The screen glowed in the dim apartment, the anchor's calm voice cutting through the stillness. It appears, she said, her tone deliberate, that the truth was not uncovered by federal investigators or rival executives, but by Isabella Cole, a woman once dismissed by her own family. Today she stands as a voice of accountability in the financial world. And there I was, frozen on the screen. Me standing in that ballroom, microphone in hand, my face lit not by shame, but by conviction. The image looped again and again, paired with words like whistleblower, hero, and fearless. My throat tightened, and before I realized, tears blurred my vision. They spilled silently down my cheeks, not from grief, but from something softer, something I hadn't allowed myself in years. Relief. I whispered into the empty room. The day they called me a maid, I thought my life was over. But it was only the beginning. I imagined Ethan and Richard, now their arrogance stripped, their fine suits replaced with prison uniforms, their futures crumbling in the echo of cell doors slamming shut. For so long they had wielded power like a weapon. Now it was gone, and in its place, justice. It wasn't vengeance that warmed me, it was the simple certainty that the truth had finally spoken louder than their lies. The shrill ring of my phone startled me. I wiped my face quickly, half afraid of who it might be. When I saw the name, my heart clenched. Margaret, my mother. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen before pressing to answer. Her voice broke immediately. Bella. Oh, Bella, I am so sorry. She was sobbing words tumbling out between breaths. I'm sorry for all the years I stayed quiet, for letting them make you feel small. Last night, watching you stand there, I have never been prouder in my life. I pressed the phone closer, closing my eyes. Her tears reached me like warm rain after a long drought. My own voice shook. Mom, I forgive you. We both deserve a new beginning. One without Richard, without his shadow over us. On the other end of the line came her cry, raw and unguarded, the kind of cry that spoke of both grief and release. We wept together, and in those tears something mended. A bond long fractured was being stitched together, fragile but real, held by the thread of truth at last. In the days that followed, the noise only grew louder. My email was filled with invitations from universities, from financial ethics panels, from organizations that wanted me to speak. I stared at the words on the screen in disbelief. Me. The girl who once folded sheets in silence, mocked for polishing hotel floors. The sister who had been laughed at over champagne toasts. They wanted my voice now. They wanted to listen. 1 week later, I returned to CNN, but this time not as a scandal's echo. I walked into the studio as someone recognized for integrity. The lights above felt just as hot, the cameras just as heavy on my skin, but I was no longer trembling. I sat straight, shoulders steady, knowing I had carved this seat for myself. The host leaned toward me, her eyes gentle. Isabella, if you could send one message to those who have ever felt overlooked, dismissed, underestimated, what would it be? I paused, inhaling slowly. My mind drifted back, Ethan's laughter echoing through marble halls, Richard's indifference at every dinner table, the sting of bleach on my hands at 18, the sound of Margaret's muffled sobs when she couldn't defend me. All of it condensed into one truth I had carried like a coal in my chest. Never let anyone else define your worth. I said, my voice steady, clearer than I thought possible. Not your family, not your employer, not anyone who tries to diminish you. Only you get to decide your path. The studio fell silent. For a breathless moment, it felt like the whole world was listening. Then the host nodded, her eyes shining, and the camera stayed fixed on me as though it wanted to capture not just my face but the strength I had reclaimed. When the segment ended, I walked out into the New York streets. The city roared around me, taxis blaring, voices colliding, lights flashing, but inside I felt calm. Not the calm of surrender, but the calm of someone who has walked through fire and come out unburned. People stopped me on the sidewalk, some with hesitant smiles, others with hands that gripped mine tightly. Thank you, they said. Thank you for speaking when we could not. Each word settled into me, humbling, grounding. That evening, back in my Chicago apartment, I sat by the narrow window. The city lights outside glimmered like constellations scattered across the earth. I opened the old journal, the one I had carried since I was a child in Boston. Its pages were filled with years of pain vows and small rebellions. My pen hovered, then moved. I have walked through my darkest nights and found light within myself. This journey is only the beginning. I closed the journal and pressed my palm against its worn cover. It felt like sealing a promise, not just to myself, but to the girl I once was, the girl who had written years ago. One day they will remember my name. And now they did. Because I had learned something no humiliation could erase. The end of a toxic bond is not a loss, it is a liberation. Family is not only what you inherit, but also what you choose to build. And redemption, no matter how late, is still redemption. People sometimes ask me if I regret what I did that night, if I wish I had kept silent, avoided the scandal, spared the spectacle. My answer never changes. I look them in the eye and say, no, I don't regret a thing. And now I look to you, the one listening to my story. Do you like it? From which city are you hearing me tonight? Let's meet in the comments and share our voices together. If my journey has touched your heart, support me with a simple thank you so I can continue to bring more stories like this. Your kindness means more than you know. On your screen now, you will see 2 more life stories I cannot wait for you to discover. There is so much more waiting here. Stay with me, subscribe if you haven't yet, and let us meet again in the next story with love, resilience, and dignity. Because if I could rise from being mocked as a maid to standing in the